reform included improved training and prohibiting chokeholds. So this was a state law that would apply to all police departments across the state, right? Then also, during the time in between or as the Black Lives Matter movement was occurring, but prior to the legislature meeting, the city of Austin was putting together its city budget, and it cut police department funding and moved those funds over to more social services, like social workers, people to try to work with communities that were struggling. And this created a pushback. And so the Texas legislature passed bills that said that if you are in a city of over 250,000 and you reduce the police department budget, then the state is going to deduct money from the city sales tax revenue and ban property tax increases. So if you are a city, is this influential leverage? You can imagine. The state comptroller collects sales tax revenue that will go to cities. Remember, here in Stephenville, we have 1.5 cents on every dollar that the city collects. It goes to comptroller, and the comptroller sends it back to the city. So the state has the power to deduct money from that revenue that would send back to the cities. Leverage. Is that going to be an effective way to keep cities from defunding the police as it was framed? Absolutely. If the city is over 1 million, the county must hold an election to reduce or reallocate law enforcement funds or have a property tax revenue, their property tax revenue frozen. So this is very similar to cooperative federalism, right? Where the federal government is using funds in order to get government entities to do something they want them to do. Okay. Then bail reform was passed in 2021, where people accused of violent crime must pay cash to receive bail. They can't use credit, they can't use collateral, they have to pay cash. This was due to a concern about people who were accused of violent crimes being bonded out and being out of prison as they awaited their trial. So, or different steps of this process. All right, so this is what they did in 2021, and that was, as I said, partially a response to public opinion with police reform. Well, there's a continued push to address police departments and to support them. So in the 88th regular session, 2023, we had a grant fund created for sheriffs, constables, and prosecutors' offices in rural counties. Since rural counties don't take in as much revenue, obviously, because they're in rural counties. And so property tax is based on residential property tax for the most part. And if you're in a rural community and you're using your land for agricultural purposes, you get a huge tax break. Now, I've never done this, so I'm not aware of how much of a tax break, but I'm told it's significant. So they're not collecting money off of that land as much as they could if it was residential. It's rural. So bottom line is these rural sheriffs and police departments just don't get enough money. And so rural economic development, this is one of those things, or is it, okay, we're going to help out these rural communities and give them a bump in funding, this grant program where they can request more funds. Texas Commission of Law Enforcement is extended to 2031 and establishes minimum standards statewide, medical and psychological fit for duty exams. Back at this time, I was asking students to select police reform if they wanted to. That was one of the options I had to research during the semester. So many of my students came up with psychological testing for police officers, making sure they're fit for duty, and they have to be put in some really precarious situations. So we want to make sure they're healthy, physically and mentally. So that helped that. Database of officers, duty to take disciplinary action if an officer has acted out of line. So these are ways that the legislature addressed what was important based on public opinion. And another one, Peace Officer Wellness Program, and there's that. So in the fourth special session in 2023, these bills were enrolled but not signed by Governor Abbott. If the governor doesn't sign the bill, what happens to it? Does it pass or does it go away?
It still passes.
It passes. Very good. So these pass. Excellent. $1.5 billion for border barrier infrastructure was legislation that was passed in 2023. Part of that funding.
Maybe I just don't recall. Why does it matter that he has to sign it sometimes? Like if it's gonna pass anyway, why does he sign some of it?
Because he doesn't want people to see that he supports it.
It's political.
Okay.
Yeah, that's a good point. But it's also political when he does sign it. And you'll notice they'll have photos and all these people standing around and yay, or something. Yeah. So if you can get that kind of publicity, it's a good thing. But if you know it's going to tick off some people who might vote for you, then just let that pass. Yeah. This included funding for law enforcement to go down there and to help enforce laws that were attempting to limit immigration. Before, state crime to cross the border illegally. Now that was passed. State crime to cross the border illegally, but there's some question, is this trespassing on federal policy areas? So this has actually been tied up in the courts since it was passed. It was implemented to an extent where the forces were getting prepared, but they never did apprehend and prosecute somebody under civil because it's still caught up in the courts. We're waiting for the federal circuit court out of Louisiana to make their decision about whether we can do this or not. Okay, so I just wanted to show you where we are, right now, with some examples of criminal justice policy. So getting back to my standard lecture, Texas is a state that is unique and has lots of attributes that we can be proud of. It also has attributes that has affected where we are today, these pathways that we started talking about at the very beginning of the semester. And just the way the state grew and developed as a republic and then a state influences the criminal justice policy that we have today. Oh, Texas Rangers were founded, do you remember from the reading? Who created the Texas Rangers?
George Bush? He bought them, right?
Yeah.
Oh, wait. You mean
Very
that one.
clever, yes. No. Although he did own them for a while, yes. Stephen F. Austin, when he brought the colonists here to Texas way back in the 1820s, I think it's around the 1830s that they decided we need some kind of law enforcement here. So he got together some people to become those Texas Rangers, and they have existed ever since. But if you think about, people are moving here, there's lots of land, there's Native Americans, there's very little settlement by the Spanish or the Mexicans, and the French settlement was pretty much decimated. So there's not a whole lot of what we call European settlements here in Texas as people move into the state. So they're settling on land, most of them are farmers, they're claiming wide swaths of land, they're growing their crops, and there's not a lot of infrastructure to support law enforcement. And in particular, once we become part of the United States and people start moving into the state, pushing westward, you can imagine you're out there kind of on your own. And especially as we push westward and move towards the Apache and Comanche territories, where they claimed land where they roamed. So we were starting to get on their land, we were pushing the bison westward. So you had skirmishes. You had skirmishes in this area. I think I've told you about that before, right? The Native Americans that were here. We had that. We had skirmishes along the Rio Grande about land claims. Was it under the Mexican government, under Texas government, and the U.S. government? There's a lot of skirmishes and contention. People who would steal cattle or horses, not a good thing, because that was your livelihood. And so there was an element of vigilante justice that was supported in this state, because you had the Native Americans, you had these land grabbers that were claiming land, people coming and stealing your cattle, your horses. where was law enforcement? Miles and miles away, right? So they took it into their own hands. There's this element,
Western individualism.
there you go. Right, exactly. That's one of those pathways, right? It's part of our Western individualism, take care of our own self. Excellent. And we still see manifestations of that today in the Stand Your Ground law that we have, in the Castle Doctrine law that we have. You have the right to use lethal force to protect your property or your life or the life of those around you. It happens. Y'all have family histories of people shooting other people? It's not uncommon in this era. It really was the Wild West. So I want to show you a couple images. So this is 1880s on the plains of his house. This is what they had to live in back there. There weren't any trees, so you couldn't build a log cabin. So they just dig a dugout, and that was their house. And this was Judge Roy Bean, Law West Texas. We talked about him before. So that's where he was administering justice, West Texas. So, frontier heritage for our criminal justice policy set us on pathways of individualism and vigilante justice, which we kind of accept, and even, and I'll take that quiz for me, to some extent, the death penalty. That's what we did.
And not off-topic question. Why did they reduce the size of Texas? If we were like originally that big, why did they take that?
Well, okay. Sam Houston, when he was our president, very careful with spending money. He wanted to keep the budget balanced. So he's very careful about that. The other presidents of the republic, no. They spent a lot of money. They got us into debt. How are we going to pay back this debt? So when we joined the United States, they offered us a sweet deal where they're going to give us that $10 million that would settle our debt and take our debts. And while we could keep our public lands, which was a good deal for us. Yeah. So that's when that happened. Yeah, good question. Mm-hmm. But it worked out for us. Okay. There are various approaches to criminal justice when you think about it. What do we do with people who have broken our laws? So our legislative bodies write our laws that reflect public preferences for behavior and what we consider to be past the line, criminal behavior, and then what are the consequences if you do cross that line and you commit a felony, violent act, destroy somebody's property, go to prison. Sorry?
Get arrested.
Yeah. Yes. But then what? So somebody has negatively affected your life, liberty, or property. Is there a consequence? Should there be a consequence? Right. In our culture, yes, we think there should be a consequence, exactly. But how should that be meted out? What kind of approach? So at the very top is the one most of us favor here in Texas. It's retribution. Retribution. You broke the law, there's a consequence for that. Retribution. You violated societal rules or moral code, right behavior. So you need this consequence. You can hear it in our candidates who campaign on tough on crime policies. You'll hear that a lot, tough on crime. Judges and DAs, you're running. Retribution. Tough on crime. You committed a crime, you're tough on it. Retribution. Just desserts is another way. This is the law of eye for an eye, tooth for tooth. That kind of proportionate and consistent punishment. We tried mandatory minimum sentences for a while there at the state and federal level, where if you committed a crime, this is what had to happen to you. It was the consequence. They had a standard that was applied. So judges had like a cell, so the upper and the lower sentence that they could apply, and then they had to decide in between those, upper and lower. There's a standard to try to make sentencing less biased, you know, or if it was affected in any way by the defendant's demographic characteristics, or just a very cut and dried sentencing standards. Well, the problem with that was it didn't allow for a lot of flexibility based on the individual defendant. And so those grew out of popularity after a while. We do still have those sentencing guidelines, but it's not as strict as it once was. Another approach is just incapacitation, just lock them up so they can't hurt anybody else. Incapacitation. This is rehabilitation. So rehabilitation is, okay, somebody broke the law, committed this crime because there's something that needs to be addressed. Maybe there's not enough jobs out there. Maybe they're having a hard time finding a job. Maybe there are no jobs around them that they can get to. Maybe there's something going on, so they turn to drug abuse or distribution in order to make a living. So we need to figure out, how can we rehab these people, rehabilitation? How can we point them and support them, get them on the path to be a citizen, a tax-paying citizen? So to reform their criminal behavior, low recidivism, which is the circulation, so you've been in prison, and then over the next 3 years, are you incarcerated again? That's recidivism rate. So people who have gotten out to prison, serve their time, and then are back in the system. Recidivism. And then at the other extreme, we have restorative justice. We don't have that much here in our state. You'll find that when I was in Illinois, they were trying some restorative justice in Chicago that focuses on healing break in society between community, the perpetrator, and victim, structured support system as a way to counteract recidivism. So it actually has the perpetrator and the victim meeting with social services people to try to mend this rift that occurred. So it's kind of idealistic, I would say, but it's a way to approach criminal justice and trying to address what are the causes behind a person committing the crime. So if you think we have the lock 'em up mentality versus restorative justice mentality, you know, and somewhere in there you got to think about how much do we want to support a person in prison versus have them contribute to our society and not be in prison. That's a consideration that goes within each of these approaches. What is most important? So here in Texas, with retribution, is punishment. Punishing people for committing crimes important. But there's a little twist to that. Okay, so this is the Department of Criminal Justice. It oversees our prisons and corrections officials. This is their mission statement. I want you to look at the language in this mission statement. To provide public safety, right, that's what we want them for, public safety, keep us safe, promote positive change in offender behavior, support these offenders in a way, promote positive change, reintegrate offenders into society, and assist victims of crime. So if you look at that mission statement, which approach does it reflect? Which of these is it most like? Rehabilitation. And I think that's so interesting for our corrections officials, prisons. Okay, let's rehabilitate them. Okay. Well, public safety, keep them behind bars, but while they're behind bars, let's try to promote some positive outcome for this. Okay. Foundations of our criminal justice include the frontier heritage. There was a lack of government presence. So that led to people focusing on their individual responsibility to take care of things. As said earlier, it's reflected in our castle doctrine and stand your ground laws that were passed in the last 20 to 25 years or so. Okay, so we have that frontier heritage pathway, but you know what? Texas, low tax, limited services kind of state, especially in the early days. So prisons could be used for social control. They were segregated. But also, you guys, we pay for prisons for most of them. And that means tax dollars. And that means people are not really thrilled about giving their tax dollars to build prisons and house prisoners. So what happened, especially you think about the olden days, like 1800s, you gotta build a prison. What are you gonna do? I mean, it's, you get the stones and, you know, whatever you need to build that building. And then you can only have 1 or 2 cells. Y'all have seen those old prisons. Small Texas towns. Okay, good. So, instead of housing them, let's lease them out and have them work on neighboring farms. So that's what many Texas counties did. They have a prisoner who's been sentenced. So instead of housing them and feeding them, they have farmers pay the county for their labor. So that helps out the county. And the county doesn't have to worry so much about finding the money to pay for them. In fact, if you go to our Dick Smith Library, down the basement, they have archives, and you can go look at ledgers that list the prisoners and who they were leased out to farm during this time period. Fascinating. Yes.
Why'd we stop?
I'm so sorry.
Why'd we stop it?
We didn't.
Oh, really?
It moved because if you think about private farmers who are paying for this prison labor, paying the county, so the prisoners are not, I should say convicts, are not getting paid. They just have to go work. They're working on somebody's farm. There's 2 ways you can look at this. So the farmer, there's no regulations what the farmer can or cannot do to these prisoners. Very, I don't know, conducive to violence. The farmer can treat them however he wants to. That's not a good thing. And on the other hand, they could escape. Yeah. So this was a situation, that's a tough thing. If you have prisoners working on a farm, you know, how are you going to keep them from escaping? So you could use dogs, right? Other implements to, if you caught them, to make them not run away again, and things like that. So that's a really good question. So convicts were leased out as labor, then worked on prison farms with no work, no eat policy. Work, you want to eat. So it kept public spending to a minimum, public spending on criminal justice, which Texans in general supported. So, okay. Around the turns, yeah.
So is this like the same as, for instance, I had a softball game years ago and there were prisoners picking up the trash in the fields? Is it the same thing?
Yes, it is.
Okay.
Absolutely, yes. Yeah, around 1900, Texas decided, hey, yeah,
What's that first point?
frontier.
Keep public spending on criminal justice to a minimum.
So around the turn of the century, Texas said, hey, you know, why don't we buy farms and have the prisoners work them? So they did. So this is the Ellis Unit Prison Farm 1978 image, but it's still in operation today, and there's quite a few farms where prisoners are required to work. And again, this is the state operating these farms now. So there's some regulatory limits to what they can do, and yet at the same time, how do you keep eyes on all of the people out there working? So sometimes, you know, they'll find another prisoner to kind of serve as an overseer, but then you have a prisoner serving as overseer, and they have some kind of vendetta against somebody else. They've got, you know, rakes and hoes and other implements that they could use to exact their own kind of justice. So there's a balance with that too. There's a study by a scholar at Texas A&M who found that even, the thing was, there's not much oversight. Some of the prisoners were operating stills in the woods. So it is what it is. So we do that. And in fact, prisoners, even if they're not going out on the farm working, they're producing lots of other things. Our license plates are made down in Huntsville, the prison there. They are also hired by companies, like people who are answering the phones, could be in a prison somewhere in Texas. They make furniture. There's just various things that they're doing in these prisons, which is all very legal, and it's also legal that they're not getting paid.
In San Angelo, during the San Angelo roping fiesta, all the prisoners like clean the stalls and stuff.
Oh, man.
Yeah, like it's kind of eerie because like you go down there to feed your horse in the morning and then there's just prisoners everywhere.
Yeah.
What are you wearing?
Is there people?
They're wearing prison guard stuff, yeah.
Yeah. Okay, there you go. And they can do this. So we are looking at U.S. constitutional amendments that enable this. And the first one is part of our Bill of Rights. Which number is this? Cruel and unusual punishment. Do y'all know?
8th.
Yes, perfect. That's the 8th Amendment. Thank you. So, the 8th Amendment says excessive bail shall not be required, nor excessive fines imposed, nor cruel and unusual punishments inflicted. Well, this has come up in Texas because we have hot seats, and 2/3 of our prisons are not air conditioned. Yeah, it's bad. So there is a regulation where they're supposed to keep it at 85 degrees at the most somehow. I guess you could do that with fans
That
or
would
something.
suck.
But because 2/3 are not air conditioned.
That's
The
all.
problem is, it would cost about $1 billion to air condition our prisons, so there's not a lot of public support for spending that much money on air conditioning for people who've committed crimes. So, right now, that's how it is. As long as it's 85 degrees, I guess, it goes any lower, might have to get that air conditioning. Okay, which amendment, do y'all remember this one that prohibits slavery? 13, excellent, 13, good. Neither slavery nor voluntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted. So slavery is prohibited unless you've been convicted of a crime, and then it's allowable. That's how Texas can get away with not paying the prisoners anything, because they're not employees. They're people who've been convicted of crimes who are serving out their time, and the state can require them to work. So yes, in a way it is penal slavery. In a way it's not, because they're not employees. All right, so this is something that we talked about before when we looked at the judicial branch. Texas marijuana prohibition since 1917. We talked about that, if y'all remember. During the war on drugs, under President Nixon, drugs were public enemy #1. And he got Congress to pass the U.S. Controlled Substances Act, which included a requirement that states pass their own. So in '73, Texas Controlled Substances Act was passed. Yeah.
Who was the first blank up there?
Marijuana. Yeah. So this is something we've been over when we talked about drug courts. This should all be familiar information. I'm not going to spend too much time on it since we've looked at it before. So '73, that's when Texas implemented its Controlled Substance Act. Then '74, we had a habitual offender law where if you committed 3 felonies, third one, 3 strikes and you're out. You ever heard of that policy? California tried it for a while. 3 strikes and you're in prison for the rest of your life. 3 felony convictions. So we actually tweaked it a little bit so it wasn't as bad. So we said 3rd felony conviction, over 25 years imprisonment, which is pretty bad right there. But it wasn't for the rest of your life. So it's over 25 years you had to be in prison. 3rd felony conviction.
Would it be 25 years plus the amount of years whatever you're convicted for? Like,
That's a good question. Okay.
you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So is it at minimum
Okay.
20? Yeah.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Do you think that they thought about, instead of like 25 years, they just take whatever you'd be convicted for your previous felonies and just add all three of them together? And then that would probably be a little more justifiable.
It's a policy proposal. Yeah. That makes sense.
Second break.
But
Take a
then
second break.
maybe situations are different.
Yeah.
There's all sorts of factors that go
Texas,
into
yeah.
it.
Thank you. Texas.
So, because of the war on drugs, what happens to our prison population?
Increased.
Boom. Got it, you got it. Yes, thank you. Alexis, did you have a question?
I was just asking what the background was for the 1973.
So,
The Texas Controlled Substance, so we were required to pass one of those under the US Act.
Is that current? Do you know how current that is?
Which one?
The schedule table?
Oh, it's current.
I can't believe fentanyl's below marijuana. That's crazy.
It is crazy. You think, people have been saying you can do it to the federal government, because we're
do you know what
mimicking the
carpet
federal
is?
government.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Don't know what
Why don't you
that
change
is.
that?
Carpet?
Yeah,
Carpet?
and they haven't.
No.
It's like 100
It's
times worse
crazy.
than fentanyl.
Oh shit.
Yes.
Hmm?
I saw somewhere that Dallas just did like in their recent election, they decriminalized marijuana.
Yeah, yeah.
Does that not go against the?
It goes against it.
state? Oh, it does?
Yeah, it sure does.
So, how?
That's a good question. Austin, Killeen, some other towns, San Angelo, they've also made similar decisions about marijuana policies. And the state as a whole is, if you're caught with under 4 ounces of marijuana, they'll just issue a fine, rather than arrest you.
I think it's.
Is it just 2? It's not up to 4?
I'm-
Oh, well, but anyway, but the point is,
That's very different though.
that's still in the books.
It's
And
4 ounces
yet,
a lot.
That's a lot.
we're, you know, moving around, and then California
2 is a 10.
and Washington, I believe, has completely decriminalized marijuana, even though it's still against the federal law.
I know Oregon's decriminalized all their drugs.
Oregon, yeah.
So they have like, I think
That's kinda
even like
wild.
heroin is like a $500 fine.
I know. Crazy, isn't it? And so there's
I
a
mean, if you
phrase
can
that I've
afford
probably
it.
used before in class, laboratories of democracy. So states are considered laboratories of democracy. They're trying new policies out to see what happens, and so the federal government's kind of waiting and seeing, okay, what happens if you do decriminalize marijuana? So that's understandable, and maybe that's the same thing going on within our state. These towns are becoming laboratories of democracy where, okay, let's see what happens. Because I might have missed something, but I haven't heard of a lot of pushback against Dallas's policy, you know?
I don't believe so.
Yeah.
It was like, it didn't make sense to me because it's against state law, but not local
Right.
law.
I know. So people who are using marijuana or possessing it, it's like, okay, what do? You know, you gotta be aware of where you are. And what's the policy there? So it's a little bit of a challenge, I would think, for those people. Because, okay, how much are they gonna enforce the law or not? No. It's kind of an odd time. Yeah. But it's changing because people's attitudes on marijuana is changing.
Do those local government, like the Dallas or whatever, do they have the authority to?
But remember my interstices? That the state has not come out and said, you are prohibited from making this policy.
So they haven't said no, so most likely yes. I see.
15
Well,
grams
right
of
for now.
business.
They just have
Is that micro?
So you don't know, maybe next year they will come down on the local government and say, you can't do that anymore. Just like they did moving money away from police departments, just like they did defracking within city limits, you know?
Ms. Grimson. Well, I don't know, let's see.
Okay. All right, so this was a prison reform that the federal government imposed. Yeah, it is less than 4 ounces. This is a law that was passed in 2021.
Okay.
So, we're talking about the prisons right now that have become overcrowded. Texas desegregates its prisons due to federal court orders and fines from 78 to 96. It took a while to desegregate prisons, and you can imagine in 78, that's not too long ago, they were desegregating prisons here. In 1980, there was a class action lawsuit, Ruiz, R-U-I-Z, versus Estelle, E-S-T-E-L-L-E. Ruiz v. Estelle was a class action lawsuit where Texas prisoners sued the Texas Department of Criminal Justice because they had horrible conditions in their prisons. And especially with the overcrowding that was going on due to the war on drugs. So Ruiz v. Estelle is when the federal court said Texas was required to reform its prison system, and they were going to have oversight over what Texas did. So federal government was watching how we handled our prison system. The court said that inmates' constitutional rights had been violated because the prisons were overcrowded. Prisons were underfunded, lack of food and clothing. And then staff brutality. The people who were working there were denying medical treatment, disciplining the prisoners with straps. Inmates were being used as guards, which put the other prisoners in a very precarious position. So, because of this, federal oversight of Texas prisons lasted until 2002. Federal government. Remember, just like our elections and voting with pre-clearance requirements, federal government was overseeing what we were doing until 2002. So what can we do? Federal government said, gotta do something, that prisons are overcrowded. Well, we built more prisons in order to house them. Okay? Billions of dollars were spent to build more prisons. And because we had more room for prisoners, the number of prisoners tripled. More space to house them, they tripled. Largely due to the law and order perspective that we have, and retribution, and the war on drugs campaigns combined, focusing on drug use and possession and distribution, made our prisons very crowded. So they were getting crowded again, and we were going to have to build more prisons because the federal government was still watching over us, right? We still had oversight. So in 2001, these nonviolent drug offenders who were there for drug possession would then have an opportunity to go to drug courts. Remember, we had that discussion on drug courts. So 2001, while we still had federal oversight, this is when drug courts started, a way to lower the population of our prisons without having to build more prisons. So large counties of over 500,000 had to request funding from the federal government. The state government gave them about half, and they had to get the other half from the federal government. And those that did started a drug court system. Those that did not get the federal grants weren't able to, but most of them did. And so that's a turn from retribution to rehabilitation. So federal oversight ended in 2002. In 2007, the Texas legislature has to make a decision. Are we going to build more prisons, because they're still crowded, or are we going to do something else? And they decided we're not going to build more prisons. We're going to try drug treatment. We're going to fund drug treatment for these nonviolent drug offenders. Build more halfway houses. Consequently, a number of prisons closed, including that Sugar Land prison, I think, is the image that you have in your textbook. So that closed at the time. So this is a graph that shows you on average the incarceration rate. People in prison for the United States is in blue. Texas is in red. You can see that the war on drugs greatly increased populations in the federal prisons and in the state. But man, look at Texas. It just jumped up above the US rate here in our state. So there were a lot of people going to prison. And as we started turning towards these alternatives in the 2000s, you can see our incarceration rates decline. So this is something we looked at before. That's the Texas marijuana laws right now. And this is the prison population, 2023. You can see people there for drug offenses. We're 28% of our prison population. So it's a good chunk of people are there for drug crimes. All right. So we started the drug courts in 2001, and we looked at this during our discussion. Do you remember this chart? Okay, good. So it shows you data to support using drug courts, because those who complete the drug court program, their recidivism is a lot lower than people who participated but did not complete or didn't participate at all. Much lower recidivism. So it's been a positive outcome to have the drug courts in place. All right, so recidivism is the first blank. It's now 20.3%. It's down from 24% in 2007. 24% is like 1 out of every 4. So now it's 1 out of every 5 are getting back into the system. Yeah?
Can you say that first blank again?
Recidivism. Yeah, so we want, you think again, do we want to have able-bodied people in prison? Wouldn't it be better for our state if they were out there working, contributing to our economy, paying their taxes? So this is good news. Recidivism is measured by 3-year cycles, and we've gone down to 50. So our legislature began in 2001 a shift from tough on crime toward smart on crime. Let's not just lock them up, but let's do it efficiently. You know, and consider we are using taxpayer dollars. And 95% of jail costs, prison costs, are footed by us, taxpayers at the state level. Federal government only gives about 5% of our costs for prisons, so it's us, the Texas state. So it's about $3 cost of 1 day of probation, about $51 cost of 1 day incarceration. Just looking at the numbers, it makes sense to have fewer people incarcerated, maybe on parole, or probation, going to rehab centers, halfway houses, trying to get back on their feet. This was so successful that it inspired the First Step Act of 2018 under the Trump administration, where the federal government did something similar with moving towards drug courts. State jails are not regulated, so those are a different story. So state jails accepted, prison appropriations increase during the war on drugs. Like I mentioned, Texas pays 95%. In 1975, we were spending about $50 million on prisons. In 2023, it was over $3.5 billion that we're spending on prisons every year. Okay, so Texas Department of Criminal Justice is in charge of prisons, stays in charge. Remember, we had that swing towards PPPs in the early 2000s with building toll roads and housing developments. We also had it for prisons. So these are PPPs between counties and corporations. So instead of the state building and operating the prisons, we have private corporations like GEO who are operating prisons in our state. So you can see the green dots in Texas are those privately owned prisons where the state will give them funding and they operate with as efficiently as possible, because of course they're private corporations who are looking for profit. So it's a little bit different than a state running a jail. It kind of helps the state out, but there are some issues with the profit motive in a prison. Cat corners and things. And about 10% of our prison population is in a private facility like this. All right. One of the things about the prison system is we've had to close a few due to just not having the staff. This is not a job that many people aspire to, be a corrections officer. It must be really, really hard. The turnover rate you can see, 26%. So look around you, 1 out of every 4 would be gone the next year. Sometimes the vacancy rate is up to 70% of the staff they don't have. So they started hiring teenagers to be correctional officers, some places where they really need them.
It's terrible.
Rough. Also, if you look at the pay scale, you know, it's kind of median salaries, you could say. Just starting out, annual salary $41,000. Not too shabby starting out. Maximum unit 43,000 or so. You can get up to 51,000. You're not going to make a lot of money doing this. It's hard work. So what we see, that's a reason for the turnover. And when the oil industry is doing well and they need people to go work for the drilling and all the different things that they do in the oil and gas industry, they have a hard time finding jobs, because you see that these correctional officers are sometimes oil field workers who are laid off, so they go work in the prisons until it's better economy and then go back to the oil fields. It's tough. So, death penalty. Again, judges and DAs win elections with what kind of crime? What kind of crime campaigns? You would think smart. Tough, exactly. Yeah. Smarter, that would be our legislators. Tough on crime would be those judges and DAs who are going to prosecute the cases. We want them to be tough on crime. It's a general rule. And that includes the death penalty. So I want to see how y'all answered that question. Which of the following best characterizes your opinion on the death penalty for those convicted of violent crimes? How many of y'all support? Jordan?
Oh, I thought you were asking us.
Oh, okay. Yes. How much support? Yes, please tell me.
I mean, I support it, but there's also that part of it that you don't support. It's like the people who are convicted but turn out to be innocent after they die.
Absolutely.
And like it's just that small percentage. So I definitely support it, because you know, people who killed 20 people don't need to be released at all, or you know what I mean?
That, and they can't escape.
That too.
I said there's always the possibility of escape.
Yes.
Like I had to write a paper on the death penalty. And I think it was Ted Bundy. Like he escaped prison and then went and committed more crimes, and so
Yeah.
in those some cases it's like
That's a good reason.
It's a way to keep from like mass panic too. So like if someone like Ted
Yeah.
Bundy escapes, I mean all those people that live in that area is going to create a panic. It could pop up in another state, cause a panic in another state, and if you just kind of end it, then so this whole time
That
goes
sounds
away.
horrible.
It does sound horrible,
Yeah.
but it's the truth.
Absolutely. I think it's interesting, so 78% of y'all, more than 3 out of every 4 of you support the death penalty in some degree. 18 do not. And 1% doesn't know. That's fair. Okay, let's see what the state, if you are similar to the rest of the state. I'll get to it in a minute.
It's slide 19 if that helps.
There it is, okay. Stop. Okay, let's see what the Texas project says. Okay, interestingly, they have not asked this question since December 2023. Remember, every 3 months is when they usually ask their questions. Not what I dropped off. Okay.
We should call
support.
them.
Wrongful conviction. Just support the death penalty. Here, okay. So support of the death penalty, you can see 39 to 30, 69%, similar to this class. Similar, there's a lot of public support for the death penalty in our state. And why is that? What does your book say about that? Remember, why do we support the death penalty?
Can't reoffend if you're dead.
Okay. That's what she was saying, you can't reoffend if you're dead. Yep.
That is true.
Tough on crime. And tough on crime is part of our culture. Remember those pathways? Unto justice, and all this kind of peace. Okay? Emphasizes why we have the death penalty, why we use it. Thing is, 1972, the U.S. Supreme Court put a moratorium on capital punishments, the death penalty, because the Supreme Court justices said that the death penalty was being imposed in an arbitrary and capricious manner. There wasn't any kind of standard, so it was up to the judge to say, yeah, you get the death penalty, or no, you get life in prison. So the Supreme Court said, no more death penalties until you standardize this process. And so states did that. That was Furman v. Georgia. It was coming out of Georgia. Then in 1976, Georgia had, by that time, implemented standards, and so that was Gregg v. Georgia. The Supreme Court looked at those new standards, and they passed muster. So Georgia resumed the death penalty, and so did Texas at that time. So Texas had redone its standards too for what is a death-eligible crime. So I believe it's page 219 of your book, somewhere around there, list what kind of crimes are death-eligible. Killing a police officer or fireman on duty, knowingly killing them, and various other crimes that are death-eligible. So this is a bifurcated process that most states have now that have the death penalty. You have 2 phases. You have your trial, where you're convicted or not of this capital crime, and then you have the sentencing phase. So the trial phase is where they're really trying to prove that the crime you committed is death eligible, that it can have a capital sentence applied to it. Yes?
So I know that some states do not support the death penalty.
Right.
Say there is a federal prison in one of those said states, could the federal, could they impose a death penalty or no, because it's in a state that doesn't support it?
That's a great question, but because it's federal, it trumps all states. Yeah, they can do it. But that would be a real big problem for that state. Yeah. So the federal government is executing people, I don't know, last time they did. much less frequent than they used to. So, yeah, but still, that could be a real problem. During the sentencing phase is when mitigating circumstances can be brought up. They can say, well, you need to consider his life, or her life, what was going on, why they committed this crime. And so at the sentencing phase, people decide, are they death worthy? Should they be put to death? So it's this bifurcated process. Of course, the defendant has a right to an attorney throughout the whole process. Their life is on the line. And then if they are convicted and sentenced to capital punishment, there's an automatic appeal to the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals. You remember that from our judicial study. Yeah, automatic. Other cases, the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals can decline to hear, but they must hear any kind of capital crime case. It's been interesting. Have you been following that shaken baby syndrome death? Well, this person has been on death row like for 12 years for the murder of his daughter by shaken baby syndrome. And so now with the new science, they're saying, oh, well, that does not necessarily cause the death. To shake, they have to shake really, really hard to break their neck that hard. So this person who was convicted because of shaken baby syndrome has been trying, his lawyer's been trying to keep him from getting executed. He was supposed to be executed very recently. Yeah. But he's still awaiting. He's going through the trials, through the courts now. And the Texas Supreme Court decided that no, he's still on death row. So they didn't stay his execution necessarily. We'll see. Anyway, that's going on. And that's an example of what might possibly be a wrongful conviction. That's the question with this case that's going on right now. Another one that took place a little bit earlier than that was Cameron Todd Willingham. I don't know if you've ever heard of him. He was executed here in this state. Okay. So let me go ahead and just look at wrongful convictions. More than 200 people exonerated for various crimes since 2010. Death penalty process is really expensive because you're paying for those attorneys, you're paying court fees. So that can take a lot of taxpayer dollars too. In 2005, Governor Perry signed the life without parole sentence. This was a new one, where before you could get parole after a certain number of years. So life without parole is increasingly used instead of the death penalty because then they know they're not going to get out, they're not going to get paroled out. So that's an easier sentence to impose besides death.
What was the last one from last night?
Okay. Oh, to Texas Court of Criminal Appeals.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay, Cameron Todd Willingham was executed in 2004. And there's a documentary out there about him that you can watch. It's really fascinating. But he lived in a house with his 3 little girls, and the house caught fire, and all the children died. And so the fire inspectors went out there and looked at it, and they said, yeah, some accelerant had been used to start the fire. You know, they look at the fire patterns, the burned part of the house. And so he was convicted of murdering his daughters and put on death row.
What was his name?
Cameron Todd Willingham.
Where's that blank? The blank.
Life without parole.
Life.
So this was, I think, like in the 80s. Let me see, 13 years earlier. No, that was 91 when he was convicted. Technology and investigations had improved a lot over time. And so they had new arson specialists look at the evidence and determined that no, it did not give proof that he had set the house on fire. So these were not necessarily accelerant patterns here. And so his lawyers were trying hard, to get a stay of execution, something, appealing, going through the courts, and then finally they exhausted everything they knew, so they asked Governor Perry, who was governor at the time, just to give just a 30-day reprieve so they could try to get more evidence and try to get this appeal again. and Governor Perry did not sign that reprieve, and so he was executed. And then later on, they found out, indeed, no, there was evidence to suggest he did not start that fire. So like you were saying, Jordan, I think it was you saying that, you can support the death penalty, and yet there are those instances. All right, you can see new death sentences in our state. So 2005 was when life without parole was started. So it took a little bit of time because it takes about 10 or 11 years for a person who's on death row, the execution to happen. So it took a while for it to take effect. We can see that our death sentences are going way down. Our executions are also decreasing quite a bit. Last year we had 8 executions, and so far this year we've had 5. It's still lower than it was 40 in 2000. It's incredible. Okay, so influences on our CJ policy. Just to wrap it up, what are some of the influences that make it what it is today? Tough on crime, lock them up. Those are reflections of our political culture. Yes. Includes support for the death penalty. Our state budget. That has an influence as well. So less incarceration is more likely when the state faces budget challenges. So parole of nonviolent offenders can happen when we are leaning towards a deficit. And 2 years ago, we were not. We had a surplus. So we didn't have to worry about that so much then. Federal policy is also federal policies, because those court decisions forced prison reform to address the overcrowding, living conditions, types of facilities. So the federal government has that supremacy clause. They can make us do those things. And then also influences come from the special interest, advocacy groups, interest groups who represent district and county attorneys, like that interest group. The GEO group that builds the private prisons, they also are an interest that can try to influence policy. Yeah.
I'm sorry, I know you just said it was the second link.
Of federal policies. Yeah. You're welcome. Federal laws, court decisions can affect how we implement our policies. And of course, influence from interest groups. Just very quick overview of CJ policy in Texas. Thank you for your attention. And we're going to stop there. Great, thanks, Dan.